What's up, everybody? I'm going to try to do some Fomenko here. He's got a lot of interesting stuff, but the difficult part is to format his material into a decent video. He'll hit on ancient Egypt, and then it'll be 3 volumes and on page 600 before he picks back up with it. If you've never heard of him, he's a Russian mathematician claimed by academics to be a pseudoscientist, of course. But he did things like calculate the dates for eclipses that are mentioned in ancient writings and show that there's no way it could have happened at that date. He made a lot of charts showing how historical details of allegedly different events match up almost perfect with other dynasties. And according to him, Jesus was born in 1053 AD and crucified in 1086, which would put us at 972 after Jesus' birth, just coming up on the millennium. And, people that want to argue with me, I'm just reading what he says. I didn't write this book. At the end, I might tell you my thoughts. He also says that the Old Testament happened in what we consider medieval times, like I think 8 to 1200 AD, and that the apocalypse was written after 1486 because it's describing astronomical alignments that weren't there until that time. He points out that pretty much the entire dating of the ancient world comes from these two guys, Joseph Justus Scaliger and Dionysius Petavius in the late 1500s. And I've confirmed this with outside sources. This is Oxford Bibliographies, and they call him the father of comparative chronology. And as an accomplished Christian Hebraist, he took an interest in rabbinic scholarship, where I'm sure he studied a book that's not listed here. So he was a theologian associated with the Church of Rome, as well as Dionysius Petavius, a French Jesuit. This was a couple generations into the Protestant Reformation, and scholarship has always been the Jesuits' things. They pick the best and brightest and make ultra them. After the Protestant Reformation, they no longer had the world under their thumb, so they started all of these universities and became academia. And like I've said about the 1300s catastrophes, that could have been as soon as just before Columbus and the New World and the Age of Exploration. But I've read the accounts many times where if they were lucky, only 2/3 didn't make it, and in some places 15 out of 16. But at some point after that happening, this became the education system. And what it looks like is they took famous events from the old world and just started making copies of it. And everything is based off of true events. And that's where archaeology can tell you what happened and what didn't happen. This is a mosaic of Alexander the Great that was buried in the Pompeii eruption. Another buried mosaic of the Odyssey, where Odysseus is tied to the mast so he can hear the siren song. And you see how they portrayed the sirens here with wings and bird feet? I've seen angels portrayed that way before, or at least what the historian was claiming this was portraying. And even buried out in a field in England, you have a mosaic portraying the Trojan War. So these things happen. There's the archaeological evidence is there to back that stuff up, or at least that people knew about these things. I still think that some of these mosaics were from ancient restaurants. Look at the size of that lobster. Anyway, those two guys came up with the whole Greco-Roman chronology. Fomenko calls it Scaligerian chronology. So let's tie in what he says about Egypt here. Flinders Petrie and other Egyptologists had estimated the duration of the history of ancient Egypt to equal 5,000 to 6,000 years. This is how the long chronology of Egypt was born, while E. Meyer and his followers had developed the so-called short chronology. And remember, Scaligerian chronology comes from the early 1600s, and they're just discovering all this Egyptian stuff in the, 1800s. But they based all this off of the dynasties list that Manetho made in allegedly 300 BC. Fomenko points out the problem is that the pharaohs and their entire dynasties often reigned simultaneously in different parts of the country. Manetho was making the assumption that the state had been a monolithic one under a single ruler. I know during the Hyksos time they were broken into North and South kingdoms, but this is what I've thought for a long time about these big long lists of pharaohs or emperors or popos. Told in Stone did a video mapping out the known tombs of Roman emperors, and these guys are spread out all over the place. So I think they might have just taken like regional governors and elevated them to emperors posthumously. So they've stretched out dynastic Egypt by thousands of years. And the best way of deducing the age of a given European culture is finding out which Egyptian dynasty they traded with. And if you're basing your European chronology off of the Egyptian dynasties that they've stretched out over thousands of years, then the same thing's going to happen to your European chronology. That's your comparative dating. He gets into radiocarbon dating and points out what I've been saying for years. Another problem has to be considered. The intensity of the atmospheric radiation is affected by many cosmic factors. Therefore, the radioactive carbon isotope production rate should also vary. It also decays faster in sunlight and warmer temperatures. There's just a million variables there. Archaeologists had been most reluctant about letting the radiocarbon method enter the certainty epochs of Scaliger's history for fear of uncovering embarrassing discoveries. The radiocarbon dating of this Egyptian collection was found to be contemporary, as in modern, when it had been considered to belong to the 5th dynasty, 4,000 years ago. The specimen that Libby had been careless enough to have claimed as modern had to be called a forgery and disposed of. And the Fomenko says that the archaeologists never even thought that the chronologies from the Scaligerian chronology could be off, and says there's no deficiency in materials belonging to the epoch preceding ours by 3,700 years for checking the precision and the dependability of the method. So they're calibrating their machine on the specimen that they're insisting is 3,700 years old based off Scaligerian chronology, with no other way of verifying this, and saying they are perfectly certain of the veracity of the datings. He also gets into dendrochronology and points out problems with that. So basically, all of our dating methods suck, and archaeologists are trying to make everything fit into Scaliger's version, where other chronologists point out that none of this conforms to modern standards. So if you got a lot of extra time, then you got to fill those time slots with something, right? Fomenko has a lot of graphs here, and he has put the Second Roman Empire, 1st to 3rd century AD, side by side with the Third Roman Empire from the 3rd to 6th century. So these are back-to-back empires, and he lists the emperors and how long they ruled for. So Lucius Sulla ruled for 5. I'm going to skip the names. 5 years, 1, 6, 2, 21. Then the beginning of the next empire, 5, 1, 6, 2, 21. So the first 5 emperors of each empire ruled exactly the same amount of years each. So you keep that method going through the entire empire, and it's almost a mirror image from left to right. So what are the odds that all of the rulers from the 1st century BC ruled almost exactly the same amount of time as the list of emperors from 200 AD? Yeah, somebody's copying their homework. Then he does the same thing with the 7th to 9th century Carolingians compared to the 3rd to 6th century Third Roman Empire, or at least a section of it, and you've got another match. And then 10 to 13 centuries compared with the Third Roman Empire, you got another match. And he does this with other factors as well. Right here, you've got the list of rulers, and right in the middle is an eruption of Vesuvius mentioned in 1138 AD that matches up with the 79 AD Vesuvius that buried Pompeii. The Scaligerian textbook of ancient and medieval history of Europe and Asia is a laminated chronicle obtained by the collation of 4 virtually identical copies of the short chronicle. The other chronicles are derived by shifting it downward in time as a rigid whole by 333, 1053, and 1778 years. In other words, the Scaligerian textbook, and therefore modern contemporary textbooks of history as well, can be completely restored from their smaller part, all of which lies to the right of the year 960 AD. He's explaining this on a graph, so to the right of 960 is after 960 AD. So you can take everything after 960 AD that happened to the right, take a section of that and paste it at 330 years ago, and then another section at 1053. And this is what happens when a mathematician looks at history. In other words, each Scaligerian historical epoch located further to the left below 960 AD is only a phantom reflection of a certain latter historical epoch. So he's saying this is just a copy of actual events that happened after 960 AD. Where from 960 AD on, you have the full chronology of everything, and everything before that is just a fragmented copy of that. Now, if you use this method from the 17th to 20th century, it contains no major statistical phantom duplicates. The interval of the 10th to 13th century appears to be the sum of two chronicles, a real one describing certain events of the 10th to 13th century, and a phantom duplicate introduced from the period of the 14th to 17th century AD, with a chronological shift by approximately 300 years backwards. This was probably the result of the activity of a well-known medieval chronologist, Dionysius Petavius. He is reflected in the past, in particular as Dionysius the Little in the alleged 6th century. It is interesting that our empirico-statistical methods had not revealed any statistical duplicates for the events which occurred after Dionysius Petavius. Most likely, this indicates that Scaliger and Petavius invented these shifts themselves and multiplied history in several copies. In the following chapters, we shall discuss our hypothesis concerning their motivation. Well, I know a big part of this is to say that the church is 1,000 years older than you say it is, and you throw in a whole lot of popas when there's not really any other history to back up this period of time. 1,000 years adds a whole lot of authority to your claim, and they definitely wanted to prove they've been around longer than Islam. And speaking of phantom duplicate Dionysiuses, there is Dionysius Exiguus. He created the Anno Domini AD dating system. So there's a famous chronologist, Dionysius Petavius of the 1600s, and another Dionysius back in 500 AD that's a chronologist that invented the whole dating system 500 years after Jesus, allegedly. And it wasn't exactly a hot ticket. It didn't catch on until the 9th century. I've heard a lot of historians say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And yeah, they're all singing the same song, just different names. Other historical doppelgangers out there, you've got Eusebius of Caesarea, where you've got a mural of him painted in 1455 in medieval garb, when he allegedly lived in the 4th century, 1,000 years earlier. And he's the guy that wrote the history of time from the Genesis to the Nicene Council. This, as well as the tractate by Jerome, weren't discovered until very late in the Middle Ages, the Greek original only being available in fragmentary form nowadays. Yeah, we have very little original source documents from the ancient world, and when a scientist realized that he could somehow use a particle accelerator to decipher these ancient scrolls that were burnt during the Pompeii eruption, Vesuvius, they didn't want to let him borrow any of these scrolls for a long time. But it's kind of like the Egyptian artifacts earlier. They didn't want to give it up to get it proved, as something else. And then Jerome that he mentioned, St. Euronymous, was a priest confessor, which is a whole thing in itself, theologian, translator, and historian. So another priest from the Church of Rome that is in part responsible for our larger worldview of history, allegedly lived around 400 AD. And again, there's all kinds of paintings of him from the Renaissance era. Here he is with his pet lion. If you want to get people to remember you, have a pet lion. But a very medieval scene, binded leather books up top instead of scrolls. Looks like some type of sextant, astrological measuring device hanging down. There's an hourglass and magnifying glass on his desk. And I know magnifying glasses, lenses weren't really developed until allegedly the 14th century. So these are all people high up in the Church of Rome that have written seminal works about world history. And Scaliger and Petavius just backdated them 1,000 years or so. The same thing was done with the Zohar. I mean, a lot of people did this, it would appear. Fomenko refers to this as adding authenticity dust because nobody questions the old dusty books on the shelves. They've been here for hundreds of years, so they must be right. Diehards will still say that the Zohar is an ancient text, but his wife said that no, He sat there and wrote it and told everybody he was transcribing it from an older text. This kind of thing was also going on in the philosophy realm of Renaissance Florence. Cosimo de' Medici, big-time guy in the church, OG international banker, and financer of a large part of the Renaissance, sponsored Gemesto Platon and his Platonic Academy. Platon in the 1400s compiled the works of Plotinus from 1st, 2nd century AD and the original Plato from 400 BC. Platon had studied in the Eastern Byzantine Empire and allegedly discovered long-lost scrolls of Plato. He brought Strabo's geography to the Western world and was a huge influence on Renaissance thought. So I recently watched a video of a scholarly type debunking the phantom time hypothesis. And in this book, they theorized that Otto III had added about 300 years of history in prior to Otto I. So to me, that's saying something that they came up with 300 years because that's what Fomenko came up with. Only apparently they didn't dig further back to find out that it's the same 300 years getting repeated 4 times over. And, 300 to 500 years is a really long time. That's enough time for an entire civilization to grow and collapse. Say there's 500 years with 300 years of actual written history, like the Egyptian priest told Plato, allegedly, is at the appointed time, the heavens open up and deluge the world and nobody's left but those destitute of letters. I just watched Eric Klein again last night. If you ever get the chance, give him a listen. I've got his book as well, but he's talking about the Bronze Age collapse and says, yeah, it was so bad that we lost writing. The Bronze Age collapse happened before the whole Greco-Roman civilization era. That was followed by the Greek Dark Ages. And the thing about the Bronze Age collapse is they know all the civilizations around the Mediterranean collapsed at that time. There's one whole area of hundreds of miles covered by ash, and there's all kinds of archaeological evidence. It's just they go by the Scaligerian dating with it. So just throwing out some completely hypothetical numbers, you've got the Bronze Age collapse and then the Roman era, then the 14th century catastrophes and the fall of the Roman Empire about 500 to 700 years ago, and then our modern era. And then they took real events from 1,000 to 700 years ago and then made 3 copies of it, stretching it all the way back to 1200 BC. And then in the archaeological world, they know which artifacts came first, who used what style of whatever. And then they take all of these artifacts and force them to fit into the Scaligerian chronology of thousands and thousands of years. So back to the guy debunking the phantom time hypothesis. He says, there's no way you could get that many people involved and keep it a secret. And I agree 100% because the majority of the people involved had no idea they were taking part in any rewriting of things. You have St. Jerome and Eusebius, most likely in the 1400s, just compiling assorted histories. And then a couple hundred years later, Scaliger and Petavius say, no, those guys lived way back in the 5th century. And then Dionysius Petavius of the 1600s saying that there was a Dionysius Exiguus who also happened to be a chronicler, and he came up with the AD dating system. After 500 years, he decided, hey, let's keep track of time from the time of Christ. Also, this is dated right before the 536 AD event, right when the world went dark, and this dating system didn't catch on for 400 years. What takes 400 years to catch on? So I don't think that there were very many people in the know, and the people that were in the know were Jesuit scholars that swear an oath of ultimate obedience. I will be as a cadaver to the commands of my superior general. So that 19 minutes was explaining about 4 paragraphs out of Fomenko's 6-volume work with about 600-700 pages each. Like I said, it's pretty dense. If I can straighten out his version of actual events, I'll try to do that at some point, but some of his stuff gets kind of hard to follow. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.